Right, welcome everybody. Glad you brought the sunshine with you.
No, I took claim for that.
Oh yeah. I'll just do a very quick, brief outline of the tour. We'll talk a bit about the Lich Gate and the churchyard before we go back into the church to give you a chance to look at the original register from 1602, which is amazing, and to hear the stories on the three memorials by that. And then we'll come back out and do a circumnavigation of the churchyard to hear a few of the backstories behind the headstones and the people of Marwood past. It'll take about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how many questions. We just need your permission to record. If anybody's not happy with the recording, you know, just drop out basically. Okay, is everybody happy with that?
Yes.
Right, David's going to explain a little bit about the Lich Gate and read a poem.
This is the Lich Gate. Every church will have a Lich Gate. Lich means corpse, and that means this is the corpse gate, which I'm glad we call it the Lich Gate nowadays,
Yes.
because I think I wouldn't come. The Lich Gate, the purpose of the Lich Gate, as far as the corpse was concerned, was that the mourners would bring the deceased and lay him or her on a stone that would have been here, or something wooden that would have been here, and then they would wait under the shelter of the Lich Gate to await the pastor, the rector, whoever, to come and lead them in, either just to the churchyard or even into the church, depending on how much they paid. And that was the purpose of it, and that's why it's here. And that's many churches still have them. The original's probably in wood. Many now in stone, and some of them very ornate, especially the ones that were done up in Victorian times. So here's a poem about the Lich Gate, or rather it's called Lich Gate. Keep the Lich Gate free for me, that I may spend eternity somewhere twixt the day and night. That place where winged dreams take flight, not quite life, but not yet death, in the measure of my final breath. It's not a limerick, you understand. It's not a fun poem at all. It's a bit gloomy.
So we're talking about the period that we know about, which is from the start of the first register that we've got, that we'll show you in a minute, which is 1602. We know that people would have been superstitious and still held quite strong pagan views. Local folklore was that the soul of the last departed kept a watch by the Lich Gate to welcome the next deceased in. So you can imagine people sort of peering around the corner. If you turn around slightly, you'll be able to see, I lost place. Right, that the churchyard has been heaped up. This wouldn't have been the level of the churchyard originally. You can see it would have been on a level with that lower path. It was a common practice basically because they ran out of space and there was nowhere else. There were no crematoriums. They had to bury the parishioners, so they heap them up and basically they're in layers. So the church walls that don't look very high now would have originally been a lot higher, high enough in fact to keep out the bears. There were bears at the time when the first church was here, wolves and wild boar that might have come in and desecrated the graves. David actually will demonstrate later on the original ground level as we walk around, and it's quite staggering actually to see how many there are. There are actually 4,444 people buried here since 1602. We don't know before that because we don't have any records, which is pretty staggering actually. Do you want to do the bit about burial somewhere?
Those people who made it into the churchyard but weren't allowed to be buried properly in the main part of the churchyard were buried on the north side, that side. You'll see some graves there now that doesn't apply to them, but the people originally tended to be, sadly, suicides, criminals, unbaptized people generally, and they had to be buried if they got in at all on the north side. But originally they wouldn't have been buried here at all.
So very few people could afford a coffin, and every church throughout England had their own parish coffin. Hello, do
Hello.
come in.
Hello. Thanks, David. Oh,
There you are. You can join in and listen, or you can go on in.
This is a
church,
tour,
entirely
Colin.
up to you.
oh, so yeah.
So you might learn something.
More than likely, I get a lot.
Right.
Not you one.
So, as I was saying, very few families could afford a coffin, and every church had a parish coffin, which was taken to the house of the deceased on a sort of a funeral bier, which was a wooden wagon, basically, and then brought back to the church. Usually they buried people within 2 days. So the body would have been brought back in the coffin and laid on the lich stone, which would have been in the middle there, right where you're standing. There is apparently still one at Fremington Church. I haven't seen it, but right in the middle of the lich gate they still have a lich stone. And then they would have been buried, it would have been a simple burial without the coffin. My personal theory is that the lich gate room there, attached to the lich gate, was used as a basic parish mortuary, or dead house as it was known, for a place to store the coffin and the bier between uses. We know it's been used for lots of other things. We know that it's been used to tie up horses during a service. It's used as a poorhouse, a school, and even a prison. And behind you in that corner you can see the bars of the prison, and it's quite, well, it's just an earthen floor and quite dingy in there. In 1841, in the 1841 census, we know there was a person called Will Groves who was 75, and he lived in this part of the poorhouse, and he used to terrorise the local children with his tales. So they all had to come past him. So between, oh David, you can do the next bit, are you? Between 1666 and 1814?
Well, we're talking about unbaptized children first
Oh
of
yes, yes, sorry, my fault.
all.
Yeah.
Unbaptized children and sadly stillborn children weren't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. According to the Book of Oaths, 1649, this is what a midwife had to swear: that if any child be dead born, you yourself shall see it buried in such secret place as neither hog, nor dog, nor any other beast may come into it, and in such sort done as it may not be found or perceived as much as you may. And then you shall not suffer any such child to be cast into the jakes, or any other inconvenient place. The jakes being the privy. Can you imagine? They had to swear that was the case.
So a fairly common practice amongst the poor, in order to allow a child to be buried on consecrated ground, was to hide the body in the coffin of someone about to be, or who had recently been buried, and maybe some comfort was gained by placing them into the arms of the deceased. We know that by 1831, John Worth, the church carpenter who's responsible for a lot of the woodwork in the church, agreed for a year to make good elm coffins for paupers. I think he must have come across some elm trees and thought he'd make a bit of money out of it. So he offered these at 12 shillings each for large or small. No doubt the parish overseers were paying him. So we know for a fact that coffins were used for all classes of people by that date. We also know that the titled and the wealthy didn't have any of these problems. They were buried inside the church, and there are inscribed flat ledger stones around the church, usually made of marble or slate. Possibly, some people say, giving rise to the term stinking rich.
People were buried in a shroud, eventually, and there was an act in 1866, which wasn't repealed until 1814, that said they had to be buried in wool. It was called the Burial in Woolen Act. They had to be buried in wool, not silk or linen or cotton or anything else for that matter, to save import costs and taxes in order to raise funds for the war. Paper could be made from rags and was in short supply. Each family had to pay, this is unbelievable, 15 shillings for an affidavit stating that their deceased had been buried in wool. This is the bit that is believable. If anyone suspected that this had been ignored, then they could, if proven, claim a £5 reward, half going to the parish poor and half for themselves. You can imagine a lot of twitching curtains. Not that they had curtains in those days. And this is this is a pro forma of the affidavit.
There were several different designs.
This was just one of them, and here's another, and they filled in the names as appropriate. And you see rather macabre pictures on them, and some of them are clearly
Seal.
what they think, what
The
you
seal
think
on
they would be.
Both of those.
Was that?
There's a
There's
seal, yes.
on
Yeah.
both of
They
those.
had
Yeah.
to sign.
Who would print
Well,
that
They,
seal?
there were local.
Originally they had to go to the magistrate,
Yeah.
but then a bit
Right.
later on the rector was allowed to take the money and sign it.
This is the blow up of the rather macabre logos on the. I don't suppose they call them logos on the affidavits. As you can see, there's a skull and crossbones in the middle. That's pretty obvious. There's the arrow of death and the scythe of death, and here is a spade and a mattock of the grave digger, and here is a shroud to show people what they should do. Tie it top and bottom. I'll show you the knot they used later. And here's a chap, we don't know why he's there, this skeleton, standing on a pedestal with an arrow of death pointing upwards. I hope
That's
I
right.
hope it's beneficial. And he's pointing upwards as well. And here is rather a camp gravedigger with his hand on his hip. And we isn't sure why he's looking like that, or whether he's relaxed is what he went.
Yes.
He'd had a good day's work, I expect.
Had enough of grave digging. He was about to chop his foot off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Right, shall we move on?
Yeah.
Okay. So here, I'm sure you've all noticed this before, this sundial built by John Berry, who lived at Mudford as they called it then, now you'd call it Mudderford, is actually one of the finest examples in the southwest, and it was even voted Sundial of the Month in January 2015. What can we say about it, David?
Well,
I'll give you that time to pass around.
it's supposed to be the have a look at that. Have a look at that. It's supposed to be John Berry's finest, and we would say that because we live in Marwood. Pass that round, you can see a bit closer there, and it is extraordinary. You see, it's offset against the porch by an angle which is to do with the angle of the sun that hits it, and that's carefully mathematically devised, and I haven't the slightest idea how. But this particular sundial has an inscription. Most sundials have tempus fugit on them, but you'll see the sun in the middle of the top is surrounded by text, and when it's been restored you'll see what it says. It says tempus fugit, mors venit, nos et umbra, which means time flies, death comes, and we are but as a shadow, which puts you in your place. Not only does it tell the time here for Marwood parishioners to come and check up on, but it also tells the time in Jerusalem and in Vienna and St. Petersburg and Paris and Berlin, and there's one. Where's the?
Oh, I've got one here.
There's one here that gave us some pause.
I'm puzzled over this.
Puzzled it over for some time, but we took a week to discover that it was in fact Tenerife, and we have no idea, except that he went on his holidays perhaps to Tenerife. No idea why he had Tenerife there. But it is an important sundial, and they're in quite a lot of North Devon churches by John Berry, and also in some private houses.
Okay, so entering the porch, which actually was the parish office. Everything that happened in the parish happened here. They were meetings to discuss parish or communal matters would be held here. Business and legal documents and wills could be compiled. There's actually examples of the rector writing out people's wills in the register. A bit difficult to decipher. Verbal contracts such as apprenticeships, indentures made in front of witnesses, payment for baptism, marriage and death fees, the 15 shillings for the affidavit to be buried in wool, and the handing out of pauper payouts. It served to keep the finances separate from the main part of the church, yet still under the control of the parish. We know that godparents took their vows here before carrying the child into the church for immersion in the font of baptism, and until as late as the 16th century, at least part of the marriage service was conducted here. And in early medieval times, when the church was here, the service was conducted wholly at the church door, as you are now. So everyone in the community passed through here at least once a week. We know that because if they didn't come to church once a week, they were fined. So it was the ideal place to put up notices on the door, for those that could read, that is.
So this is a particular church door notice, which was placed there under the Militia Act 1802, and you'll see how old it is, how brown the paper is. We found it deep under a pew a long time ago now, and it's got fairly peculiar writing on it. And it lists the order in which people could be conscripted into the militia. And it was drawn up by the constables of the hundreds and parish overseers. And it was there to say that, firstly, men under 30 and childless would be conscripted first. And if they needed more, then they would take men over 30 who were childless. Jolly decent of them. And then all men having no children under 14. And then all men having but one child under 14. And if they still hadn't got enough, they could take all men whatsoever. Clever blighters. But the whole thing was pretty well organised per parish. This is only just one parish, remember. All parishes, particularly on the south coast and the southwest, were designated what to do in case of an invasion. It was fully expected that Napoleon would be invading in and around this time. So here's a notice that went to Mr. William Berry of Middle Marwood. You are to remain in your parish and to act as you shall receive orders from the general officer or deputy lieutenants of your division. If the enemy should approach very near you before you can receive orders to do so, you are to destroy the damn thing. It's got, for some reason, I'm very sweet today. If the enemy should approach very near you before you can receive orders so to do, you are to destroy the hay and corn and the cattle of all descriptions, particularly the horses, not retained for public service, and render useless all the unemployed carts and wagons before you remove yourselves. But this step is not to be taken unless in the last extremity. And you are to assure all those people whose property has been lost, provided that they shall be repaid for it, provided it shall appear that they have complied with the proposed regulations of government and lent their best aid to promote the public service. So you can imagine everybody giving up everything they'd done, or killing all their cattle and the horses and that sort of thing, in the sure expectation of receiving compensation afterwards. And then the overseer would come along after the war and say, now, did you comply with all the regulations? And they say, well, mostly. I didn't do exactly. Oh, well, I'm afraid you can't have your compensation. Anyway, it didn't stop at that. They were so worried about Bonaparte coming that they appointed people in the parish.
I think it was in
Go inside, David,
I don't know, I might bring them in here, that's the trouble.
Come right into the door and ask them.
This is to the persons appointed to the charge of the dead stock, and this was addressed to Mr. William Berry, who at that time was at in Middle Marwood.
There's something about you.
There is something about him. I'm going to get him.
Liz's orange cake.
I'm going to get him in a minute. You are to. No, this isn't. It's not to William Berry. This is to
Sorry, folks.
Robert Baymont. This one's to Robert Baymont of Town Ridden, down the bottom here, where I live. On receiving orders, you are to proceed to Hewish Down, there to take on you the charge of conducting the stock under your care to such place and by such route as shall be pointed out to you by the superintendent of your parish, and you are to take with you provisions for yourself for a few days and a blanket, as your route in all probability will be either towards the open ground towards Somerton in Somersetshire in one case, which is a long way, or towards Dartmoor in the other. You will proceed by the roads that are pointed out to you below, taking care in all cases to avoid the public roads, which are to be left open for the troops, ammunition wagons, etc. And for this purpose you will take with you proper tools for breaking down hedges. So I expect it was pretty popular with the farmers.
They were, seriously thought. And what's amazing about that, it was an article in the North Devon Journal back in the 1900s, that obviously found this old document, was that it's the only time before 1841 that we know who lived in the parish. You know, we know how many children they had and which wagon they were in. Obviously a lot of the men were away fighting, but I might do a little project on that actually. We work out how many people were in the parish. Not many.
Come through, we're fine.
Come through. Sorry.
Robert Bayment was told in his first wagon he had to take his wife and 3 children, and in his second cart he had to take Jane Rogers' 2 children, Margaret Cock and Elizabeth Cutcliffe. It was all pretty well organised in advance, all because of Napoleon.
When we had a meeting here talking about what we were going to do and what we were going to chop, we suddenly noticed all this graffiti on the doorway, the archway, which I hadn't noticed before. But one, I mean, some of it obviously isn't genuine, but this one here says LD 1889. So I set myself the task of finding out who'd done this, and I can't. I've tried the whole parish, I've tried Sherwell, I've tried Bitterdon, and I can't find anybody that fits that. We were just wondering really what he was doing here. You know, was he here paying for something for his parents, or was back to his child, or maybe he was just come from another parish and waiting for his sweetheart and thought he'd make his mark. Right, so we'll just go into the church now. By order of the king, each church in the land had to record the life events of its parishioners so that it could identify its own people and care for the needs of the poor, which they did because the rich landowners and the lords had to pay a lot more money for everything. You know, they had to support the poor people. They had to pay more for the baptisms, marriages. So it was a very equal society, really. And then the overseers of the poor would hand out the money as and when people had none. It was so important that the king decreed that each church had to have a parish chest. This is a little mini version of it. It would have been like a strong box, you know, made of oak with metal straps on, and 3 locks. 3 locks. So that at the end of the service on a Sunday, the rector and 2 overseers of the poor, which are a bit like church wardens, would all sit down and they'd bring their key, because they had to have 3 keys to unlock it, and then they would sit down and make entries in the said register that we're going to pass around in a moment. Right, the overseers of the poor, if your name was in the book and you came across bad times and you needed to be supported with very basic things like sort of basically bread, and your name was in the book, you would be supported, but you had to agree to any children when they reached 8 to go into service, and of course some people wouldn't want to do that.
So the register was written in?
Yes. In oak gall ink,
which is made from oak galls, which you'll be familiar with, crushed obviously to fine powder, mixed with some gum, and produce a black ink with quills,
from a goose.
Sharpened goose quills, certain wing feathers better than others.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Do you want to pass that round?
Yeah,
you can have another look later.
Yeah, sorry, I was
Let me
impressed
just.
with the local names.
Yeah. Well, I'm impressed you can read them. Here you go, just pass it around.
So sorry, no.
This is parchment, which is, well, probably around here it would have been sheep's skin.
Sheepskin.
Sometimes it's vellum and it's calf skin. So it's treated and stretched and dried, and then it produces this fairly thin looking, looks like paper, and the ink that David just showed you is oak gall ink, and it's slightly acidic, so with the porosity is that a word, of the parchment, it sort of sinks in, because it's slightly acidic. If it were on paper, paper would probably be destroyed. And then you think that's over 400 years, and yet it's still readable. And in places that other things have been spilt over the top, whether it's blood or wine, I don't know, but you can still see the writing on the pages. Which
when you get to look at the text there, you'll see that it's in exquisitely regular hand that varied between one person and another writing, but generally the letter format was much the same. It's called secretary hand, and it was universal across the nation. And so people who taught clerks, etc., to write, and even in schools, would teach secretary hand for the likes of this sort of thing.
And
extraordinary.
you might have noticed that on my right shoulder I've got large letters MP. Anybody any idea what that might be? Not military police and not MP. No, it's what they call badging the poor, and it was another law that anybody who received relief, as in money for bread and basics, had to wear a P, which was a pauper, so I'm badged as a pauper, and then the M was so that it was Marwood, so they couldn't nip it down the road and have SP for Sherwell. And they all had to do that.
Riccardi Riley, STB, that's it, as it were his degree. That's Richard Riley, who was rector of this parish for 49 years.
Yeah, right. He died still in service at age 90 in 1853. Unfortunately, he wasn't here the whole time because he spent 2 years in Exeter jail for insolvency before returning to Marwood and carrying on as before. He wasn't the most popular rector, it has to be said, and in, I'm not sure what year, 1814, his brother and his uncle in Cambridge brought a case against him and invited anybody locally who he owed money to come forward, and come forward they did.
And so his vintner, his grocer, his farrier, his chap who did his wallpapering and that sort of stuff, all of them were owed money. They all the list is about 30 items long, just for local suppliers. So I don't know why his brother and uncle decided to take a case against him in Cambridgeshire, but it certainly happened, and he was sent for trial and he was tried and found guilty, and then of course all his debts were probably written off. So he didn't mind spending 2 years in Exeter jail, knowing that he'd come back here again and carry on with his ministry.
So together Richard and his wife had 7 children, but we're interested in one we know quite a bit about, and that was his son Richard William Riley, who's also a rector. The first we hear about him, he's in Puffill near Bude in 1841, and he's single and aged 33. The next indication we have of anything unusual is that he's charged at Cornwall County Assizes with a bastardy order, and the charge, unusual one, is administering poison to procure miscarriage, and that's because he had an affiliation with the landlord's daughter, who was 17 years younger than him. So as soon as he was acquitted from this charge, they travelled to Barry in Glamorganshire. Rebecca, she was the daughter of Abel Rowland of the Union Inn at Puffill, and they marry and return to Puffill, and 2 months later their first child, Anne, is born. She's actually baptised here in 1848. They have 8 more children. Some of them you'll see, they're buried in the churchyard.
And he came back and assisted in the ministry here. He was curate here for years.
The next one we're going to look at is Trooper Frederick Willis, the monument on the wall. Right, he actually started at Marwood School on the 1st of August 1881, which is quite interesting, I thought. And in 1901 he signed up for the 27th Imperial Yeomanry, and we know from, this is his actual paper that he filled in to join attestation papers, that he was 5'5½", which was probably average height in 1901. He weighed 140 pounds, he had light brown hair, and he had grey eyes. But he didn't last long in South Africa, the Boer War. He was killed and is buried here. That is actually an Imperial War grave that's maintained by them. It's basically just sand with some stones on the top. Very dramatic. There's quite a lot more information there. And then in 1904, because the church was closed when he died, the church was being renovated, the North Devon Yeomanry arrived, and the report is that 30 of them all arrived, and I assume they arrived on their horses in all their gear. It was a bit of a PR exercise, I suspect, and dedicated that tablet to him. This next story we'll tell you more about that. It's about a baby born in a quarry, and this here is the granddaughter of the lady who had the baby. But it's quite an interesting story. It's all about poverty and success, really. And then lastly, before we go outside, on the wall up there, there's remember Noah Passmore, who was leader of the bell ringers, and he was also a church warden. He and Mary left money to the church, and it's sort of the gift that goes on giving, because it was wise and the interest was still providing for things in the church. In fact, I think they paid for some of the lights as well. I don't know that. Yeah. Right, so the first one we're going to have a quick look at is John Gore, and he's the father of Mary Jane Passmore, the last memorial we looked at on the wall. He was also a blacksmith, but the unusual thing about him is he was the 7th son of the elder John Gore, and if you were the 7th son, everybody believed you had special powers. And they used to do this thing called striking, where he would arrange to meet someone in a field on a moor or something, walk past them and literally hit them, and they were cured.
It's easy, really.
Yeah, that's John Gore Senior, who was also a blacksmith, is listed in the census as being a veterinary surgeon, which I don't think he had any qualifications for that, but they obviously did basic things to horses, I assume. And he committed suicide, which meant that we don't have a record of his burial. We know when he died. We know when he committed suicide. That was October 1859. But people that committed suicide weren't allowed to have a church service, and he would have been allowed to be buried here, but it would have to be between 9 o'clock and midnight, which seems a bit odd. Before that, before 1823, he wouldn't be allowed to be buried in consecrated ground at all. He'd have to be buried at a crossroads somewhere.
Sit-in is of Mrs. Chapel, that we know a bit about because there was a newspaper article in 1847 which read, "A Mrs. Chapel of Honeywell, Marwood, gives birth in a quarry on her way home. It was her 18th child." That was Daniel, who died in 1849 and is buried here in the churchyard. And of her 18 children, 9 boys and 9 girls, the only boys to survive past 2 years of age were Dennis and Emmanuel. Dennis Chapel, 1843 to 1932, was the 15th and last surviving son of John and Mary. Mary was formerly of Knackersole in Berrin Arbor. She died in 1885 at the age of 80 and is buried here. John died in September 1882, aged 88, and in the 1881 census they're living in Mudderford, listed as paupers, looking after their grandchildren. So they were some survivors, I have to say, to 88 and 80. Quite extraordinary.
We're going to go down here in a second. I just found these that I'd lost before. So from 1813 to 1867, I'm going to get stung in a minute. They started recording ages at death. Before that, we have no idea. So of the 799 deaths in that period, 1813 to 1867, 208 were of children under 5. So basically, if you got past 5 and you survived the war and you survived childbirth, you lived to over 80.
That's true.
So this is the memorial headstone of William Grigg Willis and Mary Ann Willis, who were the parents of Trooper Frederick Willis that we just talked about, who died in the Boer War. And they are within sight of their grandson, who's the last named one on the war memorial on this side facing you, who died in the Second World War. And at the time of the First World War, the time of the First World War, they had 4 of their sons away fighting, and they were William, Samuel, George and Thomas, and they all came home, which is, I think, amazing. Just a couple more things I forgot to say. The most popular girls' names through the whole period that we know were Mary and Elizabeth, and also Grace and Charity were quite common. And the most common boys' names were John and William, not surprising, and a few more unusual names we've come across in the register were Bartholomew and Theophilus, which I don't know anybody called Theophilus these days.
Oh, I do.
Oh, do you? If you follow David, he'll lead you to the angel.
This is the memorial to Bessie. Her real name was Elizabeth Jane Crang. She was baptised here in Marwood in 1860. She was the daughter of John Crang, who was a considerable farmer and landowner in the parish. He seems to have owned about a third of the parish. And she married well. She married Alfred John Jury of Sidmouth. He was a bank manager. Sadly, although she married in 1894, she died shortly after childbirth in 1897 as a complication of childbirth, sadly. So this rather grand memorial, certainly the most grand in this churchyard, was because she had an expensive family and he married into an expensive family. But it's an extraordinary memorial. It was an early sculpture of a man who later became famous, called Harry Hems. And Harry Hems used to sign all his sculptures on the back or somewhere discreet sometimes, or in your face sometimes, IXL, which he was convinced, or wrote it because he meant I excel. And everybody else would assume that there was probably some numbering or system or something. However, he knew what it meant. But he later went on to be quite well known, and he built himself in Exeter, in Longbrook Street, a workshop, which is still there to this day. And that workshop is now a restaurant called Harry's, amazingly. And if you go there, the outside is exactly the same. The inside's a bit different, but the outside's exactly the same. When he was making his way up from St David's Station up the hill into the city, he came across a horseshoe, which he picked up, was being cast by a pony or a horse earlier in the day, and he picked up this horseshoe and decided it was going to be his lucky charm. So much so that he built it in to the front of his workshop. And it's in a special place, and if you look carefully, for the purposes of bringing luck, it's upside down. But he apparently had good luck nonetheless. And underneath it says IXL.
So there's a little piece of an article in 1898. They obviously put this angel into the workshop window, if they had a window, to sort of show it off. And there's a little bit about it here. It's of marble and represents a sculptured angel, slightly over life size. So now I wonder how you managed to measure an angel. Yes, quite. But the important thing about it is made of Carrara marble, which comes from Tuscany, and there are quarries all along this sort of hillside. And the other famous statue that came from that area was Michelangelo's David. So you can imagine what this must have looked like before it got weathered. Good word, yes. Yeah. But if anybody wants to have a look for IXL,
if you can find the IXL, we've looked, but if you can find it, there is a prize, which we'll declare once you tell us where it is.
We have scraped a little bit of moss off looking for it. But it must have been so expensive. I mean, it's such a fantastic memory. All one piece.
She's missing a finger, unfortunately, pointing up to the sun.
Well, I think there was.
Marwood is extremely fortunate in being the recipient of a meteorite that fell to Earth and plumped itself absolutely plumb centre in this granite square here. Absolutely extraordinary and nonsense. However, it's a lump of granite.
And it isn't going to fall over, and nobody's going to move it. So it is unusual, and we don't know where it came from. We don't know if it was granite from the family estate or the reason for it. But it commemorates Lawrence Hayworth and his wife Rosina Kate Mortimer, and Whitefield Barton was their seasonal family home, so they had other properties. Her father, John Baskerville Mortimer, drowned at sea on his way home from India along with her 1-year-old sister Elizabeth Caroline, so I think the whole estate passed to her. if you look in the Lady Chapel in the church, there's a beautiful stained glass window, and she donated that, dedicated to Lawrence, and then later it was changed to include a dedication to her son who died in the First World War. Right.
It talks about the churchyard
Oh, yes.
being built up of layers and layers of dead bodies. You can see how high the wall was if you care to look over the top here.
She said to me that when she was a little girl, she used to come and the family used to put flowers on the graves. She used to come and talk to this angel, and it really entranced her, and she used to leave a little bouquet of wildflowers. So when she came on Thursday, she picked a flower and put that in there. And this is Robert Simon, who died when he was 4 months old, and he was the son of Robert John and Diane Harris, who were local builders, I think.
Yes.
And in the next 2 years, I just looked up in the records, they had a son and a daughter. So this was obviously, and I thought it's such a sweet little statue and nice little story to it.
Well, you may be able to see why it's unusual.
Have a look, see why you think it's actually unusual, but not Beatrice, because she knows the answer. It's facing the other way.
It's facing the other way.
Yeah.
And can you see who it commemorates?
Evans,
Priest. Okay, he was, Thomas Guy Evans was a priest in charge of Marwood, was Marwood's rector at the time he died. So because he was in service when he died, he is buried facing his parishioners. All the other parishioners face with their feet towards the east, and he faces them towards the west. And that's the case up and down the country. It's just one of those facts. The only sad thing is that had he died after he'd retired as a priest, he'd be facing the same way as all his ex-parishioners, and it seems a bit unfair.
So this here is the grave of Sarah Leonora Riley, who is the daughter of the rector you heard about, who ran off with the landlord's daughter, and the granddaughter of Richard Riley, the Life of O'Reilly rector. Presumably they had no credit locally because they had to go to Ilfracombe to get a stonemason to do the stone, and whereas a lot of the others were local. We've never been able to find Richard Riley Sr.'s headstone. We know when he was buried, but the headstone is nowhere to be seen. And I just wondered if it was there and he was buried next, his granddaughter was buried next to him, in which case he would have been facing that way because he died in service, but we'll probably never know. Or if the locals did for the gravestone, I don't know. So this is, as you can see, the headstone for William Trick and his wife Jane. Jane Bray, that was her maiden name. She married William in 1829 and they had 7 children before, in 1845, she gave birth to twin boys. Sadly, neither the babies nor Jane survived, leaving William to raise the ones left at home, which was another William, 5 years old, and Sarah, a 2-year-old. So times were very hard for all the family, especially sort of agricultural labourers. There wasn't a lot of prospect for them, and they were tempted to seek their fortunes in new lands. William's sister, Anne, who was known as Nancy, married a John Huxtable of Bideford, and in 1839 they applied for and were accepted onto the fateful emigration ship, the Java, that sailed from Plymouth for South Australia in 1839. I feel we ought to break into a round of Bound for South Australia here.
This wasn't the only emigration ship. There were notices all over Devon, West Country anyway, offering free passage to Australia, and you qualified by having a skill like you were a farrier or a stonemason or whatever, a bit like happened in the 60s with the £10 ponds. And if you were accepted, you went on board with your family. And it was a most gruesome voyage. We have an account of it, which is in the books in the church. And I think you've got one extract from it.
I've got one extract, yes. New Year's Eve, 1839, days at sea, 92. Row this evening with the sailors. One who was drunk attempted to stab the second mate. He was seized, and when about to be put in irons, the crew rushed in and rescued him. The captain and 4 mates then took their swords and pistols and at last secured him. And if you want to know what happens, you'll have to look in the booklet in the church.
But it was an awful voyage. A lot of people
Dreadful.
died. Babies born on the voyage and died. Some born beforehand and also died. They got to Australia, fortunately for most of them, but it was such a dreadful voyage, and so badly run, etc. The captain wasn't allowed to land, and he was sent straight back to England.
And never sailed again.
Never sailed again.
Former founder, of that, Jill and Eddie, with her husband, co-founded it. She's buried alongside two of her children, Katie and Tom, who had a life-limiting disease that inspired the family to fundraise for a much-needed hospice for sick children, and they promised themselves that they would, carry this out and have a hospice so that nobody would have to travel more than 90 miles for treatment, which is what they did in the early days. And now there are 2 more hospices, and they're still all going strong and providing a fantastic care.
It was dropped for various reasons for the rest of this bit here, but the capstones are still on top. But this was the original wall, carried on at this height, and if you look over, you'll see, again, even better idea really, of how many layers there are likely to be here.
So this one, if you have a look at it, always amazes me. It's in such good condition, especially as it's flat and it's under the trees, and yet the lettering is probably as clear as when it was erected. So this is another Riley family grave. It's hard to miss, being placed quite prominently, and it's been quite large. And it commemorates at the top Edward Gower Riley, who was the son of Richard Riley the elder, who died while he was at Caius College in Cambridge, and then 3 of the daughters, who none of them married, and they all lived to a fair old age.
They, I don't know what it is about spinster daughters of rectors. Where I grew up in Walkley, about 30 miles away, the house I grew up in was the house that the Reverend William Thurrell built for himself when he retired from the priesthood and left the living to his son Leofric. He had 3 spinster daughters called Salome, Godiva and Marigold. And when I arrived in Walkley in the early 50s, it was still in somebody's memory that Salome wore a blonde wig, slightly on the skew.
Especially after a couple of sherries.
Yeah.
Now I always say that looks like breeze blocks, but apparently
No,
it's
that's
very
dressed
expensive,
granite,
dressed granite.
Granite.
Yes, dressed. So this is the Smart family grave. It's Dr. James Smart, the creator of Marwood Hill Gardens, who died in 2002, actually aged 84. And David does the bit about
Well,
it.
he's buried alongside his father and his sister, who were both killed sadly many years before that in 1966 as a result of a car accident, and also in the same grave as his mother, who died rather much later than that. But the fact that, not surprisingly, the flowers on this grave are usually in good fettle, but the wind has been a bit unkind to these beautiful alliums, as they were about a week ago. Beautiful blue and bees buzzing around them. But John Snowden, Jimmy's only relative really, who lives in Australia and has done for years, was due to come back last year, and I understand was going to do something about the headstone, so I'm sure when he does come back that'll be on the list of things, because he usually has a long list of things.
So over the months we've been doing these tours, when we first started, these alliums were just in bloom and they were absolutely surrounded by bees and all sorts, and and now they're almost over, which is So this grave, in here are the parents and grandparents of the Elizabeth Jane Crang with the angel, that is commemorated by the angel. It's obviously they were quite well off to afford something like that, and the inverted torch symbolises death, and the burning flame, which obviously would normally be extinguished when you turned it upside down, represents the flame of eternal life.
And it used to be, many of you will remember, up the other way, the torch of learning, which was the
on the school
road sign for a school before it was dumbed down and a couple of children holding hands crossing a road.
which I as a child thought was an ice cream. Read on this patch just to prove the theory that it was mounded up and when, and that's 1782. So whatever
Right,
they did to this, it was before 1782 on the
Yeah, but they also, with people who might have been around, relatives at the time, raised up the
Raised it
stones
up.
rather than put them
Yeah.
against the wall.
yeah. So basically we don't know when, but at some point. So we come to our last memorial, which I think is the most poignant of all, and it's last 10 page. This comes from an inquest in the North Devon Journal in April 1835. Young woman named Grace Stoyle. The accident was as afflictive in its consequences as fatal in its results. It occurred at Derby in the environs of Barnstable on Thursday last. A young woman named Grace Stoyle, 19 years of age, in preparing a solution of beeswax and turpentine to polish her furniture, unfortunately overturned the vessel which contained it into the fire, and the flame occasioned thereby communicating to her apparel set it on a blaze, in which state she ran into the yard and from thence to a neighbour's house, where assistance was rendered her to extinguish the flames, but not until she was so much burnt as to occasion her death on the Saturday following. Can you imagine the agony? This unfortunate girl was highly esteemed for her modesty and piety, and was shortly to have been married to a young man who is mate on board a trading vessel, which arrived in this port from a voyage a day or two before the occurrence of the accident. It goes on to say that the remains of the deceased were buried at Marwood, of which parish she was a native, on Tuesday. The corpse was borne by 8 sailors dressed in blue jackets with white trousers and gloves, and followed by a train of several hundred sympathising individuals. I just can see that, them coming down here, carrying the coffin. And there's a very touching verse on the bottom of it, which David will read to you.
It's not a laugh a minute, but it is touching.
Yeah.
Trust not to your fleeting breath, nor call your time your own. Around you see the scythe of death, the morning flowers cut down. End.
End. And after that sad note, I'll send you all in for a cup of tea. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.